Welcome to the High Summer Garden Tips and Tour. It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And the Middlesized Garden is in southeast England. It's a walled town garden. And it's 100 feet long and 80 feet wide at its widest, but it's L-shaped, so it's 40 feet wide nearer the house. And we roughly equate to a USDA zone of 9 because our winters are very mild. It's rare for us to go below -6 Celsius, 21 Fahrenheit, but usually our summers are nowhere near as hot as a zone 9 would be. And indeed, most of the plants in this garden grow across a wide range of zones and climates, so I'll put their hardiness up on screen. And high summer is a bit of a difficult time in the garden. Everything gets sort of dried and frazzled, and some things have grown too much. And in our replanted border, things aren't looking great, and that's because I've made a few mistakes, which I'll go into later. But there's one part of the garden that I think works really well in a high summer, and that's the shady bed. And that's because the shady borders don't dry out as much. The sun doesn't bake down on them and make their plants look all frazzled and dried up. And one of the plants in a shady border that really does well, starting out about this time of year, is hydrangeas. Their flowers are looking beautifully fresh now, and then they slowly sort of age and they get a sort of vintage look in autumn. And then in the winter, quite often we've still got the flowers and they make a wonderful frosted, sculpted shapes. So hydrangeas are a flower that I think you really should look at again, particularly if you want some colour in high summer. Another thing that's really worth thinking about, although not doing anything about yet, is your trees. So let's have a look at two trees here which have, I think, hugely improved just in the last 6 months. This one is a conifer, and when we first moved here, we had branches right down to the ground and we lifted them slightly, and that created a bit more light and space. But last September I got a local tree surgeons about trees to lift the branches a good bit higher and shape it, and actually that's created a much more open feel while still keeping the shape. On this side it's a lime tree, and it used to have one single trunk. It's actually been here for a long time, much longer than we've been in the house. But we decided at one point that we didn't want it, so we cut it down, but we didn't take away the trunk. And what happens with trees if you don't take away the trunk is that often they sprout again, but they sprout in multiples, which is how you get multi-stemmed trees. And so it sprouted up, and I think we might even have cut it down again and it sprouted up again. It's sort of coppicing. But earlier this year it was just sprawling all over the lawn here. So I asked Felix, who helps me in the garden and who is also an artist, to take out all the branches that were coming outwards below head height, and just to allow the slim upright stems to be seen. So I think it's a rather beautiful multi-stem tree now, and of course it's revealed quite a lot of nothing much underneath it, and I'll have to plant that up at some point, but I still think it's much better like this, and I'm really pleased. So let's go to the back of the border where there's another plant which I think has become, I wouldn't necessarily say unfashionable, but I think we've rather forgotten about it, and that's the fuchsia. Because I've got a fuchsia here at the back of the garden. It's called Delta Sarah, and I think it's incredibly pretty. It's got lovely white, blue and pink flowers, and I do absolutely nothing to it except prune it once a year in the spring. And I think it looks so pretty beside the slightly bluish tinged leaves of the Euphorbia wolfenii, and of course the white bark of the silver birch. But now let's go over to a part of the garden where I have learnt a lesson this year. Along here I have bought two identical Pinky Winky hydrangeas, which I bought last year, and I planted them in two identical tubs and using identical compost. But as you can see, the flowers on this are beautiful, they're big, it's a very, very healthy looking shrub. That one, the flowers are half the size, and even the shrub itself is a bit more spindly. So what went wrong? Well, the problem with this one is that in the spring and early summer there were quite a lot of self-seeders, even up to midsummer, and they looked really pretty, things like poppies and things, and I couldn't bear to pull them out. But actually the nutrition in a pot is really limited, and if you allow that much competition, it's going to take the poppies and the weeds and things are going to take nutrition away from the hydrangea, and I'm pretty certain that's what's happened. So I have weeded the pots and I have added some extra slow release fertiliser, But although weed your pots doesn't often appear on the gardening to-do list, I think it might be a good idea to add it. So now let's go into another corner where things are a bit iffy. So we're going past this fabulous Phlomis russeliana, and this is really happy. It's dry shade, it's spread everywhere, it's lovely and sculptural, it looks great in frost, you know, 6 months of shape and colour. But I would quite like not to have a border that's entirely full of Phlomis russeliana. So let's go over to this corner. Now, the main thing about this is its dry shade. We also had About Trees do some work to this tree, which is a lovely old Verbena frisia. And it's got something called an included union, which is where the two main stems have merged together, and that can put pressure on the tree. So what they did is that they thinned out the whole of the canopy and they raised the branches, and that has created more light underneath. So this should be an easier place to grow things. It looks lovely in spring and early summer because there's lots of self-seeded Smyrnium perfoliatum and other things like that. But all of those have died off by the time we get to high summer. And what I'm left with is some lamb's ears, some hellebores, and I have just planted some Jack Frost, Brunera Jack Frost. Now, I think I want to plant this with ground covers. So I've got a video with 23 ground cover plants, which I'll put in the description below. And taking from that video, I would like to plant Epimedium, which does very well in dry shade, and Brunera Jack Frost, and some hardy geraniums. But the key to this is that even if the plants are good in dry shade, in their first year they do need watering because they haven't got the root system to go right down and find the water that's there deep down in the soil. And because this is the most distant corner of the garden, I really have to remember to bring the hose right the way out here and to water them. But I have been keeping up and they just about look as if they're doing okay. I have to say none of them look very, very enthusiastic, but I think we'll keep our fingers crossed that this time next year this corner will be looking better. I'm now going to pass quite quickly past this border, which hasn't really done anything much. And the main problem is that I've never really known what I wanted to do with it. And if you don't know what you want from something, it's very hard to actually achieve anything with it. But we do use it as a bit of a dumping ground. And if we've got spare plants, we just put them there. So I think I'll move on quite quickly from this. And now these are what used to be the veg beds, and I didn't have time to grow vegetables this year, so I planted them up with 3 packets of wildflower seeds. And there's a video which I'll put in the description below about how to grow wildflowers. But the short and the long of it is obey the instructions on the packet. This I failed to do, and I overseeded it, which means that the vigorous plants grow up really well, but the less vigorous plants struggle because there's once again too much competition. And what this can mean is that you miss out some of your successional flowering because these borders are a mix of wildflowers that will flower at different times, provided of course they've all come up. But I'm still really love it because actually it's been so brilliant for the bees this year, and we do seem to have had a bit of a problem with not enough bees. But now over to the area that is really not doing terribly well, and that's the herbaceous border. And firstly this corner. Now I planted some geums here when I revamped the border, and the problem once again is competition. The geums are not in the right place. Geums don't like to dry out, and because this is a sunny border, it dries out much more quickly than a shady border would. Although geums are technically full sun flowers, they're actually better off in partial shade if it's going to be very hot and dry. And we don't get much rain in the summer in this part of the world. So, also here, I've planted a big grass, a pheasant's tail grass. It's a bit too close to the geums. And the other thing is that I do actually rely on self-seeders quite a lot, and there's a self-seeded plant called Lychnis coronaria, which is very pretty with grey-green leaves and pink flowers, and it's been gorgeous, but it's just spread over there and it's pretty much swamped the geums. So not only are the geums not in a great place, but they're being completely overwhelmed by what's around them. So I have to bash a few heads together really. This is not a good time of year to move plants because it is usually too hot and too dry. So all I can do is to cut back what I want to cut back, which is the lichtness, and just hope that the geums will kind of manage and be okay next spring. Another thing you can cut back in high summer are the hardy geraniums. This is Anne Thompson, and she's been brilliant. She's been right out like this with lots of lovely cerise flowers, and they were still flowering. I didn't really want to cut it back, and that's the problem, you know, it just looks as if it's still flowering. And then I started to cut it back a bit, and then I found that I was cutting it back more and more, and then I really cut it back from literally that high right down to that. And you can see that some new green growth has come through already. It's a good idea to give it perhaps a water, maybe a liquid seaweed feed, and there should be another bout of flowers perhaps in about 4 to 6 weeks' time. So here, I'm quite pleased with this grouping. When I replanted the border a couple of years ago, I did make a great deal of effort to make sure that I planted the perennials at a good distance apart. And Rosie Hardy of the YouTube channel Rosie Hardy Gardening says that if you actually literally hold perennials like this, that'll be about right for most of them. Big ones will need a bit more distance, small ones can go a bit closer. But if you haven't got the instructions, then perennials shoulder width apart pretty good. Well, I just didn't quite manage it here with this other pheasant's tail grass, which is looking gorgeous, but it is completely swamping the sedum, or Hylotelephium as it's called now. Thank you, botanists, here. So that is just looking a bit choked, it's not showing at its best. And then here we've got chrysanthemums, which are just coming out, and they will be flowering really late summer, early autumn. So it's got a bit overcrowded over here. I'm not going to chop anything back at the moment, but I think in the autumn I might try and create a bit more space. Further along here, there is a great debate. The thing is that the Verbena has self-seeded itself right on top of 2 dahlias. And of course, once again, the competition's too much. And the dahlias are hardly doing anything. And they certainly won't have brilliant flowers if they're competing with the Verbena. So my decision has got to be, do I get rid of this lovely cloud of Verbena bonariensis in the hope that those 2 dahlias might just flower? But then they might not because they've had a pretty hard summer of it. Or do I keep the Verbena bonariensis and accept that the dahlias are never really going to flower? I think, to be honest, I'm going to do the latter. I don't know what you think, because I've got no guarantee that the dahlias will recover from their Verbena bonariensis having stolen all their nutrition. And I do love this cloud of purple, but on the other hand, I won't have the lovely dahlia colour later on in the year. I am going to, there are various gaps in the borders where I've managed to pull things out, and I am going to put pots of dahlias in there, so we will have some colour. So apart from actually pulling things out and cutting things back, the most important thing to do at this time of year is deadheading. And not every plant needs deadheading, but dahlias, roses, echinops, all are brilliant deadheaded. We've got some echinops here, these tall things at the back. I am definitely going to cut those down because they will once again sprout up again. You'll get new flowers again. With roses, keep deadheading, and the most important thing is to keep feeding. Ian Limmer of Beta Beals Roses, I've interviewed him about choosing roses and talked to him about black spot. And he said all roses get black spot at this time of year, just accept it. But give them a really good long-term slow release rose food, and they'll have new foliage and they'll have more flowers, and you won't notice the black spot so much. And my roses have been brilliant since I took that advice. They've just flowered literally throughout the time. We've talked a lot about hydrangeas in this video, and if you want to know more about growing hydrangeas, this video coming up now will tell you everything you absolutely need to know, so don't miss it. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.